Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to another one of our webinars around the impacts of COVID-19. Today is a special day in that we're not going to be dealing so much as what the government stimulus packages are. We're going to deep dive a little bit into one of the areas, and that is superannuation. Now, along with me, you may have seen a couple of hot topics in the media in relation to super. The first one being that there's been a lot of people accessing their super under the special COVID-19 arrangements. And secondly, that there's some reports that some superannuation funds may use the cover of COVID-19 to write down the value of their investments. Now, it might sound a little bit complicated, and it is, so that's why we've assembled today a panel to help us address these topics. So today we've got with us Tim McCarthy from Sage Business Group. We have Pablo Bilella and Sarah Wang from Acambo, and they form part, along with me sometimes, form part of Sage Wealth Management. Good to have you along, guys, and looking forward to this webinar.
Thanks, Michael.
Although part of the team, my role today will be moderator, and I'm going to be addressing some of the questions that come up. So up front, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions because some of them are going to be very, very specific to you. Of course, you should be getting some specific advice around your affairs, but if at all possible, I will try to answer as many questions as we can. Before we get into it, the legal stuff. Certainly, this presentation is general in nature, and therefore, if you are after some specific advice, take what you learn, but then go and actually seek the appropriate professional advice. So I won't get you to read everything, but it's a very important document. So let's get into what we're going to be covering today. First up, we're going to look at the early release scheme. We're going to have a look at some asset allocation, which is getting technical, but really important to know. You know, superannuation is a bit of a mystery thing, so to be able to look in behind the scenes would be fantastic. And then we're going to finish off with some liquidity issues and the politics around this superannuation area. So let's get into it. But one thing I do want to actually point out is for those people who haven't worked with this yet, over on the left-hand side, you'll see a traditional model where you, the client, you tend to work with your financial planner. And you can see the arrow going one way because sometimes there's not a lot of response back from your planner, and you're dealing with your tax and accounting team. In the middle there, this is how we like to operate. You have your financial planner, your tax and accounting team, and you, the client, overlapping. And that sweet spot, that blue spot in the middle, is where we like to operate. That's where Sage Wealth Management do their best stuff. So for a lot of clients that do work with us, you feel pretty special. We do talk behind your back because that's important to make sure that the planner and the tax specialists are talking about you, the client, and your situation. It's just a snapshot of what we do differently at Sage Wealth Management. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Tim McCarthy today. And Tim, you're going to talk about early access to the super scheme.
Yeah, I think I've got the easier subject of the three, Michael, today, because we're talking about the early access, and a lot of people have heard about this. It's basically a proposal whereby you can access up to $10,000 from your superannuation fund, and you get two bites of the cherry. One being between now and the 30th of June, and the second being between the 1st of July and 30th of September. But it is important to realise that you only get one crack in each of those two periods. So there's no option to say take 2,000 and 3,000, a little bit more, go 5. It's just two bites of the cherry. And the only qualification method really required around here is that your income has dropped by 20% or your working hours have dropped by more than 20%. And some applications have already in place. So it was a way of stimulating the economy and allowing people to access some superannuation whereby they may have lost their job, in particular, was said to be a real concern. And it's all trying to meet the payments of the household, which in actual fact all makes a lot of sense, because for some people, it's going to be a really, really important measure to help them actually get through this period. I guess if the government has time, I wonder if they would have changed their thoughts. And I wonder if they would have thought, I wonder if we should have some more tests around this. How do we actually manage it? Because what's also happened is byproduct of a lot of the stuff that's going on at the moment is that people are now saying, oh, here's an opportunity to touch my super. Here's an opportunity to get some money in my pocket. Gee, not a bad option. I'll do it. Not necessarily for the reason it was intended and not for a need. And therefore, they're getting a short-term hold, sorting that out. But they're also taking a risk because they're actually cashing in their asset when we all know the value of funds and the market in general has dropped. So they're cashing out that time. So combined between the super and JobKeeper, there's provisions. JobKeeper is another provision for people to be able to access the money. So before we go accessing money, maybe we should be looking at whether or not it's a wise idea. It seems very, very easy, and I'll show some numbers in a sec. They actually tell us exactly how rampant, I guess, this has all become. Because when we look at the numbers, and I think this is a shock to everyone, there's already been over 900,000 people applied to the tax office for release of their super money from their super funds. And I think early doors there were some big numbers thrown out there, but I think we all thought that won't be real. Well, here's what's happened is there's estimating that somewhere between 30 billion and 50 billion is going to leave the superannuation environment. Now, in anyone's language, that's a B, not an M. That's a big, big number. B for billion. So because of the nature of the workforces they're covering too, are primarily the money's coming out, if you think through who's actually losing their jobs, who's needing the money, there's retail, there's hospitality. These are probably some of the industries that are most affected by it. And often, because of the nature of workforces they're covered, it's the industry funds who are actually bearing the brunt of these drawings. Saw some numbers over the weekend. The average balance of one particular industry fund is about $35,000. Well, if they're going to have a lot of members pulling out potentially $20,000 over the next 6 months, that creates some severe liquidity issues. And like Australia's biggest fund, Australian Super, they've already paid out $319 million to 40,000 people. Now that's a little under 2% of their 2.1 million members. But they're also processing another 45,000 applications, we understand, at the moment. That means 4% of its members are looking for some money. The numbers are huge. So there's all sorts of outcomes that are adverse because of that. And for those who are currently in industry funds, because there's heavy lifting, they're facing some issues that they don't even see coming, particularly around write-downs and liquidity issues. So what I might do is invite Sarah, with those sort of numbers, that's the boring part, but let's look at some asset allocation and how it measures defensive assets and how it all is going to work. And I'll swing across to the specialists here. So I'll start with Sarah, who will talk us through the asset allocation and what it means and how they determine what is a defensive asset.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I just want to talk to you about asset allocation and also what industry super funds have been doing. So if we go to the next slide, and so basically we just wanted to show you in the last 10 years how some of the super funds performed. Up until the outbreak of COVID-19, most of the super funds have posted really, really good returns. A survey found that growth super funds in the decade to 2020 returned a median of 7.9% per annum, so that's pretty good. However, they were greatly outperformed by leading industry super funds. And as you can see from this table, that host class being on top at 9.2%, and followed by Australian Super, which is around 9%. So really, we wanted to look at how they have outperformed throughout this period. So Tim, if we go to the next slide. So one of the reasons have been heavily promoted by industry funds is that they have low fees. And we probably have seen that on the TV commercials quite often, compare the pair. Although to some extent that's true, however, they also do so by having a limited number of investment options tailored to the members' needs. So they reduce the overheads and therefore lower the costs. But more controversially, many large industry funds typically have quite large exposures to unlisted investments like property and private equity and infrastructure, and they are normally considered as high-risk investments. So the true reason for the superior return is a direct result of industry super, and they allocate a large amount of money to growth, but label them as a defensive assets. Let's take a look at Host Plus. So who is default balanced option? And as you can see here, it's 76% growth assets and 24% defensive assets. I will talk a bit more on the next slides, what are growth and what are the defensive assets. Firstly, the name of balanced clearly mislabeling, because normally should be 50% growth and 50% defensive. Most of us all know that to have a high risk is associated with probability of high return. So the question is, if you are with an industry fund, are you taking too much risk? Do you know if your super money is invested in the right investment options with the level of the risk that you are comfortable with? Now on this chart, we want to compare two different balanced funds. On the left, that's the standard balanced fund. As mentioned earlier, it should be 50% in defensive assets and 50% in growth. So normally defensive assets includes cash, fixed interest, and credit, and they normally comes with lower volatilities and risks. And then the growth assets, you have shares and property and alternatives, and that alternative could include infrastructure investments. However, when you look at your right-hand side, as you can see, that's not the case with Host Plus. As I mentioned in the previous slides, Host Plus listed with 76% growth and 24% defensive on the website. However, in reality, as you can see here, the growth actually can be up to 93%. This is because they have classified infrastructure and property holdings as a defensive assets, and that are held in unlisted vehicles. This is quite misleading and raises two concerns. Firstly, the value of the investment is an opinion of fund manager, and there's no way of knowing whether the value is credible, given there's no open market for the asset. And the risk nature of these assets is usually exposed towards the end of the market cycle, which is what we are experiencing now in the last 2 months. For example, following the global financial crisis in 2008, the real estate investment trust sector fell by a whopping 75% globally, because these funds had a greater income couldn't be sustained under high debts and falling prices. Second worry is that the investment is very illiquid, and the sale can be constrained by agreement with co-investors, which means in a falling market, you have to find a buyer for unlisted assets, and that can be very difficult. This goes against a critical characteristic for defensive assets, which is ability to sell in a deep and open market with much less volatilities. So during that period, some super funds stopped the members from transferring money out because they were unable to sell illiquid unlisted assets. One fund in particular, MTAA Super, lost $1.6 billion due to poor hedging of unlisted assets. Also, recently, Senator Bragg has said that there's too much reliance on super funds on unlisted assets, including infrastructure and property. In this example, it has shown that they are taking large amount of risk with members' money to this result. Now they have the real issue of paying these amounts out. this takes us to the next topic, liquidity issue, which I will pass on to Pablo, and then he will speak to you now. Thank you.
Hi, so yeah, this is just getting a bit of feedback there. Give me 1 second, I'll just turn it down. Hopefully that's a bit better. So this is just how far the strain is going into the industry super funds. Just thought I'll add a quick article, and there are dozens out there like this. Tim, you could just go to the next slide. There's some industry funds like Host Plus that have gone through the process of updating their PDSs and not releasing or not allowing the release of funds or cash to members or allowing switches. So this is just one of many. There are other 4 of the majors out there that are doing the same thing. So it's a bit concerning at the moment. They're just rewriting the rules because they've got really a major lack of liquidity at the moment. So just so going to the next slide, we've got the just the political landscape at the moment and the industry super fund. So Tim Wilson is the chair of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics. He's asked some real valid questions to the industry super funds, mainly about their trustee responsibilities, and has asked the following to be answered by the 29th, which was last Friday. So we haven't received any notification of what was said and what the industry super fund said. But the main thing is what they want to know is the asset valuations. So as Sarah was alluding to before, how are these determined? And asking why write-downs on unlisted assets have been so much smaller than the 40% slump suffered by listed infrastructure holdings. So what this means is that Transurban, as an example, between their highs and lows, dropped 38%. But the unlisted assets that they run, that is half owned by the industry super funds, has only dropped by 10%. So they're not saying it should be an exact like for like, but there is a major gap between the two. So they also want to know on January 1st, what was the percentage share of the listed and unlisted assets and what their projected losses are. So these questions are really opening the door of how industry super funds categorise investments and how they state these ongoing returns, as Sarah spoke about before. So Tim Wilson has also little sympathy for super funds that can't pay out members' money when they want their money back. It's pretty straightforward. He's asking the questions about whether some super funds understand their investment strategies and making sure they're being proper trustees of members' money. So I'm an individual with a self-managed super fund. I must abide by several rules, laws and regulations, but at the moment, it seems like the industry super funds are making their own or just changing the rules as they go along. So what are the overall numbers? So Tim McCarthy spoke before about what's expected to leave the industry. So currently the Treasury estimated when they first did the early super scheme was about 27 billion will leave. So what is that as a whole? Well, it's 1% because there's a total of $3 trillion in the asset pool at the moment. So figures show currently there's about 184 billion in cash across the whole super system. That includes SMSF, retail and the like. So it's hard to believe that even though it is a big number of 27 billion, it's still only between 1 or 2% of the full 3 trillion that we've got going at the moment. So the liquidity issues are running quite deep. Labor Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers has supported the bailout of RBA, so he wants the RBA to come out and help the industry super funds and other super funds pay out the funds that members require. And others are coming out saying, well, we shouldn't reward this bad behaviour and keep industry super funds doing the same thing and expect a bailout every time there's a downturn. So this is why questions are being asked of the super funds as a whole, and it's coming to light how high risk their investments are and how they categorise them. So from here, what can you do? So over the next slide, look, it's pretty simple. We just want you to take control, ensure your future is protected and understand what's going on. I mean, they're the main things that we want you to get out of today. Be aware of what's going on in the industry. At the end of the day, it is your money. So make sure that you're on top and have the understanding of what's going on. So just a quick one. We just want to highlight that Sage Wealth Group as what Michael was speaking about before and how we differ from the run-of-the-mill super funds. For us, it's really determining your goals first, and then those goals are really what's keeping you up at night. And then from there, we try to extract even more and more and try to have this and work a strategy to get these goals in place. And then we work on a structure. So that structure can lead to being an SMSF or a wrap account, which is a different type of super. whether the assets need to be running in your own name, through a trust or a company. And then from there, that's the solution, which comes down to the asset management of it all. So as industry super funds and other super funds manage these assets, we run a little bit different. So the way we run these investments, the majority are usually direct holdings in these chosen structure. Because of this philosophy, we don't really have any liquidity issues, and we'll never stop you from taking money out of your own account. On an ongoing nature, we actively manage your financial solution as well as these assets as well, and make sure we continue and reset these ongoing goals, because the goals that we start at day one will definitely be different as time progresses. We always make sure there's enough liquidity. We take up risk, put on risk when necessary, and we speak to our clients on a personal one-on-one basis to make sure that we're meeting these goals. So that's all we really want to go through today. I'll hand it back to Michael just to go through and just quickly wrap it up.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Sarah and Tim. So covered a fair bit of ground there. One of the, there's 3 lessons that I got from there as I was listening was that, number one is don't assume that what's happened in the past is going to happen in the future. Different ball game altogether now. COVID-19 has just turned everything upside down. The next one was I had written down get personalised service. I actually crossed out get and said demand personalised service from your advisor. And Sarah and Pablo showed us a snapshot of what's going on in the industry, and we refer to it when we're talking to our clients as lifting up the doona and having a really good look underneath to see what's there. What are the numbers that are driving the investment of your superannuation? So that's what I took from there. I just had a quick look at the questions. There's none there that we can really answer specifically, so we'll take those offline. Just to say thank you once again to Tim, Pablo and Sarah, and we'll look forward to catching you on our next webinar on Thursday actually, but thank you everyone and have a great day.
Thanks.